All right, here we are again, back together after a long stay of absence simply because it took me a while to put myself back together after the chaos of peak and just being just exhausted and having to do kind of a hard system reset almost. But that's over. It's behind us now. Here we are again. Friday the 13th of all things in a December. So that's kind of cool, but that has nothing to do with what I want to talk about. What I do want to talk about is a study I came across last week, which was talking about kind of the financial activity of different people of different generations. And it referred to itself over and over again as a study, but it really seemed more to me like it was a poll where it was just asking people what their opinion of their own spending patterns were. Like, basically, it's kind of like one of those Facebook things where it's like, which would you rather do? This or that? Which would you rather do? This or that? Strongly agree, strongly disagree, sort of thing. And so they didn't really analyze the data, and they didn't try to like compare and contrast the data against like the hard facts of the respondents' like personal financial records to see if what they were saying matched up with what they actually did with their money. Nevertheless, it ended up being really interesting because they took different people from different generations: boomers, Gen X, millennials, or Gen Y, and Gen Z, and asked them how they kind of pattern their money, what their philosophy of spending is, what they prefer to spend their money on. And not surprisingly, the older two generational categories, boomers, Gen X, tend to associate a lot more with particular brand identities, I guess. They tend to identify more with that a Mercedes-Benz is more indicative of wealth or status, a prestige, than a Ford Escort, for instance. Whereas millennials and Gen Z were more likely to equate like a vacation with a quality spending experience, I guess. They preferred experiences to objects. They wanted to spend money on things that they could go do with someone. And one of the examples that they used is that boomers and Gen X were more likely a man actually go to a jewelry store on his own and pick out like the largest diamond that he could afford, the 6 months wage, what do you call it, kind of spending window that was popular a while back. Whereas millennials and Gen Z, which already they tend to delay marriage a lot longer than previous generations, closer to 30 than 20. But when they do get married, they're more likely to go together as a couple and have the person pick their own ring out than they are, and to make sure the size fits, and that they are gonna do it as this whole shopping experience together, rather than the guy like do the sudden or unexpected like pop the question circumstance. So like little interesting kind of nuanced differences that way. They claimed in and of themselves, millennials and Gen Z tend to claim that they didn't value collecting objects. They didn't want to have the garage full of cars per se, or the trophies up on the wall, or the like the signed memorabilia rooms that Gen X, and boomers tend to value the signed Babe Ruth baseball from the Sandlot, things like that. Like, they didn't tend to care about those things as much. And that's kind of where it went off the rails for me as I was getting towards the end of the study. It didn't really seem to jive. For lack of a better term, I don't really buy it, since this is a financial study. Because earlier this week, my wife and I, we were out shopping. We were at the mall, and it almost seemed like it didn't matter what shop you walked into, there was an entire wall dedicated to the Funko Pop figurines with the gigantic heads and the small bodies, right? Hot Topic, For Your Entertainment, Spencer Gifts, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, any of those kind of half-price bookstores, they all have them. They're everywhere. And they're a major industry. There's a film coming out about them. There's a board game about them. There's the full-size ones, I guess, and then there's the miniature, the keychain ones, right? The keychain bobblehead ones. You have fig pens. And, I've talked at length about my personal affection for Hot Wheels, which has not gone away. They're still kind of a cultural giant. I don't buy it. I think what it comes down to is that millennials are more willing, and Gen Z is more willing to spend on that kind of useless junk, essentially, than it is willing to spend money on major purchases. Whereas boomers and Gen X were willing to spend the $128,000 to have a Mercedes-Benz SLS AMG in the garage. It seems like millennials and Gen Z are willing to nickel and dime themselves on Funko Pops, fig pins, things like that, little supposedly collectibles that eventually will probably amount to the same amount of money, the 128 grand by the time they die, as that Mercedes-Benz. It's just not a Mercedes-Benz. And I can appreciate the idea that they'd be more willing to just go down to Disney and get a decent hotel and spend like a week there, rather than having a RV or a mobile home or a fifth wheel and drive down there themselves and find a place to stay, kind of thing, that boomers, Gen X might have done instead. They tend to value the money spent doing things rather than on an object that you have to store and maintain and whatever. I can appreciate those sentiments, but like I said, I'm not yet entirely convinced with this idea that millennials and Gen Z don't care about physical objects that they spend their money on, because as far as I can tell, they spend their money on useless objects the exact same way. As the previous generations did, the only difference is it didn't come in a catalog. It wasn't from First Collections. It wasn't from the Heritage Collection or the Danbury Mint or some of these things that were so popular with the china plates or the rare coins or the whatever it is that Gen X and boomers would have been so interested in. It's not a literal silver ingot, right? But when I used to work at a retail place in which when the Hot Wheels would drop a new line, which they do every year, like right around February, they would have a new set of the 8 or 12 cars in a specific line. There'd be 20, 30-year-old guys that would come in and they'd buy one of all of the cars from that set, and then they'd leave them in the package and they'd put them in a box somewhere, hoping that at least one, but possibly the whole set, would gain this magical value at some point in the future, and they'd be able to resell them for more on eBay or Facebook Marketplace or wherever, right? We have this obsession with collections the same way that previous generations do. I think what it comes down to is that millennials are less self-reflective about it. That for some reason, millennials and Gen Z are just less cognizant of the way that they're spending their money. That maybe they've believed their own PR, I guess you could say, in a way, and that they convinced themselves that these are their priorities, experiences, and so they've let go, or they kind of dismiss the nickel and dime way that they're spending money on these same objects to build their DVD, Blu-ray collection, their Pops cabinet, their whatever, those kind of things. So that's kind of my takeaway from it.